All right, how does this look to everybody out there in Zoom land? Great. Okay, so I'm gonna kind of follow up on what Andy was talking about. Um, and it was really interesting to hear Andy's comments about how, he's kind of old school statistics, because I was really old school statistics. And, then Andy comes along a decade or two later, and then Aaron comes on a decade or two later. And what we've seen is this incredible advance. So for me, it was amusing to hear Andy feeling like saying that he really wasn't up to speed on statistics. So one of the things that's been extremely beneficial during my career is I've had these two brilliant graduate students working on these systems with me who keep updating our abilities to bring the latest greatest statistics and modeling to the problems. But I'm going to be really focusing on the processes because that's what I think about. And it's always nice when what I've been thinking about intuitively about how the processes work are sort of confirmed by the statistics and modeling that Andy and Aaron are able to achieve. So I'm going to talk about marine heat waves and decadal scale variability in the Northwest Atlantic. And as Andy mentioned, during the decade from 2010 to 2019, the Gulf of Maine and the Northwest Atlantic more generally was experiencing a series of marine heat waves and warming faster than 99% of the world ocean. The impacts were observed in kelp forests as well as cod and lobster and right whale populations. And again, at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, where Andy went to after he left Cornell and also worked with Kathy Mills, who will be here next week, they really put together a nice story telling us what was going on in the Gulf of Maine during those two surface heat waves. One of the things that's really interesting, Nick Record, who came out of Andy's group, was looking at these same time series, and more recently, he's been observing what he's calling potentially a cold wave. So there's this early warning of a potential cold wave in the Gulf of Maine. And this is a paper, it's been published early. It's not actually out yet, the issue of oceanography. But what it shows you is that basically in the decade of the 2010s, we're looking at a TS diagram. We can see that we had, much warmer water and higher salinity water during the 2010s. And if you look at the prior decade shown in blue here, you can see that those values were much lower. But then in 2024, so this year, we've seen that the values have dropped significantly in both temperature and salinity, really approaching what we were observing during the previous decade. And if you look at the time series of temperature and salinity, you can see that the temperatures dropped in 2004, as did the salinities. So, Record et al. Are reporting this rapid shift towards colder, fresher water in the deep Gulf of Maine as of mid-June 2024, and it's persisted for at least 6 months. The shift is associated with an influx of this cooler Labrador subarctic slope water, and it resembles the conditions prior to the major warming of the previous decade. So the multi-million-dollar question is this simply an example of interannual variability? Because you can see, if you look at the time series, you see this isn't very long duration. And we do see things like this. So is it really the beginning of a decadal scale regime shift, or is it an example of just interannual variability? And finally, I sort of throw this out there for people to think about in the context of this workshop. Is it really appropriate to call this a cold wave? And does it imply the termination of a heat wave? So I know many of you are from all over the world, so I want to just kind of quickly review the parts of the region we're looking at, that I'm going to be talking about. So this is Cape Cod in Massachusetts, Woods Holes right here. And the different ecosystems we're going to be looking at is the Gulf of Maine here in particular. The southern border of the Gulf of Maine is this shallow, very highly productive bank, Georges Bank. To the southwest, we have the Mid-Atlantic Bight. To the northeast, we have the Scotian Shelf, which is primarily Canadian waters, and eastern Gulf of Maine is also Canadian waters. We have the Gulf of St. Lawrence here, which is the extension of the St. Lawrence River and St. Lawrence Estuary. And then we have another large, highly productive shallow bank, the Grand Banks off of Canada. And, you know, a lot of this work that I'm going to talk about today started as part of the U.S. Global Ocean Ecosystems, or GLOBEC program, where we were studying the Northwest Atlantic, and particularly we're looking at Georges Bank. And there was a very large field study that was conducted over a number of years to try to figure out the dynamics that was driving the zooplankton and fish populations on this highly productive submarine bank. And so this is the area that was being studied. And part of the reason this area was chosen as a GLOBEC study site is that the Gulf of Maine Georges Bank region is an oceanographic transition zone in the Northwest Atlantic between the subpolar species up to the north and the more temperate, warmer water species to the south. And in particular, you know, it sits at this region that is strongly impacted by two very large current systems. One is the western boundary current, the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream moves along the continental shelf up to about Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, before it turns offshore. It also, it's not really shown in this, but it starts to meander when it moves offshore, and then it starts spinning off warm core rings that move to the north, and cold core rings that move out towards the Sargasso Sea. So the Gulf Stream is bringing up this warmer, saltier water. And then this region is also at the southern end of this system with the Labrador Current, which includes waters that move along on the shelf itself, as well as the Labrador Current that moves along the shelf break. As it goes down around the tail, what's called the tail of the Grand Banks, a lot of it moves offshore and joins up with the Gulf Stream to form the North Atlantic Current. And a portion of it, and it's a relatively small portion of it, makes this turn around the Grand Banks and then heads down to the Scotian Shelf, Georges Bank, and eventually the Mid-Atlantic Bight. This is a much smaller part of it, but it's incredibly influential in terms of what goes on in these ecosystems. And there's another area here that sits between the Gulf Stream and the continental shelf called the Slopewater Sea. And the Slopewater Sea is filled with water that is, some of it is surface water that's that comes from there, but a lot of it, a lot of the characteristics of the water in the Slopewater Sea is influenced by this cooler, fresher water coming down in the Labrador Current, which is what we refer to as the cooler Labrador subarctic slope water, as well as this contribution from the saltier, warmer Gulf Stream, and that is what we call temperate, warm temperate slope water. So when we got involved in this study for GLOBEC, we were really interested in looking at the factors that were affecting the recruitment of Calanus finmarchicus from the Gulf of Maine to Georges Bank, because Calanus is the dominant copepod species by biomass in the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank during the spring and the early summer. But one of the things that's really interesting about this species is that it basically disappears from Georges Bank for half the year. So it's really it's really an expatriate, what we call an expatriate population. It's being advected onto the bank, and if you didn't have an upstream source, that species, which is the dominant in spring and summer, really wouldn't be on Georges Bank. So what we were interested in looking at was testing this hypothesis that recruitment from the Gulf of Maine is what drives the interannual variability of Calanus's population dynamics on Georges Bank. So the Gulf of Maine has 3 deep basins, and the deep basins are areas where Calanus goes into a seasonal diapause, and it goes into deep water. These deep basins are between about 300 and 400 meters deep. So they're on the continental shelf, but they're deep basins. And they, so we're talking about, this is the Gulf of Maine here, here's Georges Bank, and there's an area, there's a small channel called Northeast Channel, which is where the slope waters, both the warmer temperate slope water as well as the cooler Labrador subarctic slope water, can enter the Gulf of Maine. And those deep basins have those different forms of slope water in the bottom of them. And again, these deep basins are where Calanus goes into diapause. So in the late 1990s, before some of you were born probably, we conducted a study to map out the distributions of Calanus in the deep basins of the Gulf of Maine. And we had this, I think it's still one of the coolest instruments that's ever been developed in biological oceanography. We called it Biomapper 2. We had a video plankton recorder mounted on the front. We had 5 different acoustic frequencies. We had 5 transducers facing up and 5 facing down. And we used to tow this instrument behind the ship, and we could go about 6 knots, which is pretty nice, so that we could actually survey these large areas, these large deep basins in the Gulf of Maine, completely within a 2-week cruise. And we had the video plankton recorder to sort of back up and help us, interpret the acoustic data we were collecting. We also had, the full suite of environmental sensors, temperature, salinity, chlorophyll, fluorescence, you name it, we had it on this beast. We also had a mock nest. So during our surveys, we would stop and we would take net samples of mock nests. Mock nest stands for multiple opening closing net with environmental sensors, sensing system. And so this enables us to take samples at different depths in the water column. Again, we can use that to help ground truth the acoustics and intercompare with the video plankton recorder. And just to give you a sense of what kind of data we could get with the video plankton recorder, this is a mosaic of images that I put together showing Calanus finmarchicus when it's in diapause. And these are pretty incredible when you think about it, because this bug is, only about 2.5 millimeters long. And we're taking these images while this instrument's being towed at 6 knots. And you can see this is the 5th capepidite stage when Calanus is in diapause. And you can see the large lipid reserves inside the copepods, which enables them to survive while they're in diapause. So we did these cruises in 1997, 1998. Unfortunately, we didn't do a December cruise in 97 because it was that October cruise was the first time we took the biomapper out. We figured, we're going to be spending the rest of the year figuring out how to make all these systems work. But it actually turned out that we got great data and everything worked really well. So we were kind of kicking ourselves that we didn't ask for a cruise in that December, but we did have October and December of the following 2 years. And what we're looking at here are the 3 different deep basins in the Gulf of Maine, and we're looking at Calanus abundance. And what you can see is in 1997, we had pretty high abundances of Calanus. We had comparable abundances of Calanus in 1999, but in 1998, we saw dramatically reduced abundances of Calanus. It's like, what's going on here, right? And this kind of had us revise our hypothesis because, as I mentioned before, the shelf populations of Calanus aren't self-sustaining. So even in the Gulf of Maine, if you reduce the input of Calanus coming in, after a few years, even though they can go through their whole life cycle and go into diapause in those deep basins, eventually, if they're not being supplied from upstream from these external sources, they'll disappear. So we thought that maybe these fluctuations in abundance might be reflecting climate-driven changes in ocean circulation. And what led us to this hypothesis is there was a lot of work being done in Europe, particularly in the North Sea, looking at how different phases of the North Atlantic Oscillation were affecting the recruitment of Calanus. And so we got very interested in looking at the complex linkages between the North Atlantic Oscillation, so climate, and the physical oceanography, as I mentioned before, the Labrador Current, the Gulf Stream, and the slope waters, and how that would affect the plankton, and then ultimately the upper trophic levels, fisheries, as well as protected species like the North Atlantic right whale. So what we're looking at here, this is the NAO index. And again, remember those years that we were doing this study were basically the last 3 years of the 20th century, so 1997, 98. And what you'll notice is that in 1995, the winter of 1995, 96, the NAO went from the second highest value of the 20th century to the second lowest value in 1 year. So there's a tremendous drop in the NAO index. And that seemed to line up if you look at the time lags with some of the other things that we were observing. So what we were interested in doing was looking at how the ocean circulation in the Northwest Atlantic responds to the North Atlantic Oscillation. And what we've seen, and I'm just kind of giving you a summary of it here, is that during positive NAO conditions, the Gulf Stream's north wall tends to shift to the north. So we're talking about, the Gulf Stream in this region shifts to the north. And what that does is it limits how much of the Labrador Current transport around the tail of the bank. It weakens when the Gulf Stream is pushed up. When during negative NAO conditions, the Gulf Stream's north wall shifts to the south. That allows more of the Labrador Current transporter around the tail of the Grand Banks. And so what we saw after that big drop in the NAO indexes, we saw, this change. And this region in the slope waters, that I talked to you about, Andy and I wrote a paper talking about the coupled slope water system and how the slope waters are influenced by these changes in the Labrador Current, as well as the changes in the Gulf Stream, and how that affects the slope waters. So during positive NAO conditions, this coupled slope water system is what we call its maximum modal state. And that is characterized by, again, the north wall of the Gulf Stream is pinching up against, if you will, the tail of the Grand Banks and limiting the amount of Labrador subarctic slope water coming into the system. During the negative NAO conditions, the north wall of the Gulf Stream is shifted to the south, and that allows more of this Labrador subarctic slope water, particularly along the shelf, to move down as far as the Middle Atlantic Bight. And then this is kind of cool. So throughout the most of the 1990s, we had warm slope water, primarily of Gulf Stream origin, in the deep basins of the Gulf of Maine. This is the Gulf of Maine bathymetry that we're looking at here. And then in 1998, so 2 years after that big drop in the NAO, we can see this intrusion of Labrador, of this cooler, fresher Labrador subarctic slope water coming in through Northeast Channel month by month. And then we can see by the end of the year, it's actually starting to recede. So this is when Andy got to work starting to put together some new indices for us to sort of characterize this regional slope water or this coupled slope water system. So we put together what's called the Regional Slope Water Temperature Index. And what that does is it basically looks at the deeper temperatures in the deep basins of the Gulf of Maine, Emerald Basin, which is on the Scotian Shelf, and as well as the slope waters that are out, on the continental slope. And so, using that, we were able to define this regional slope water temperature index and then begin to sort of look at how that time series was influenced by the NAO index. So again, if we sort of focus on the time period that we were doing our cruises, and one of the things I think I really want to emphasize to you is, us seagoing oceanographers are only out there for a few years at a time, and you can't really say very much about climate, with data from cruises that are conducted over a short period of time. So, we needed these time series to kind of provide the climatological context within which we could interpret the biology that we were seeing. So what you can see is the NAO index, again, underwent that drop of the century in the winter of 95, 96. And we see that with a time lag, we see that there's this drop in the regional slope water temperature index. So that's the response of the slope waters. We're seeing them cool off in the various regions, particularly in the deep basins of the Gulf of Maine. And, we tried to figure out, well, how well do we really know this system? And so we put together a model that basically characterizes the state of the coupled slope water system by looking at the regional slope water temperature index. And what we showed is that we could, if we had the value of the regional slope water temperature index from the year before and the NAO index for that year, we could do a really good job of predicting what the NAO index would be for the following year. So you can see this is the observed and the predicted. So we kind of felt like, okay, we have a little bit of a handle, at least on one mode of climate variability and how that influences the physical oceanography. So the next question is, how did the plankton respond? And yeah. So again, we had data from 3 cruises, but what we really need are data for decades to interpret this. And fortunately, as Andy mentioned, the continuous plankton recorder surveys had been going on since the late 1950s. So we had multiple decades of data being collected on this transect, basically from New England to Nova Scotia. This is the instrument that Andy was talking about, the continuous plankton recorder. This is Sir Alistair Hardy, who invented it in the 1930s. You can see there's a tiny aperture in the front. This thing is being towed behind commercial vessels. So it's being towed at typically like 10 or 12 knots. So it's moving through the water quickly. It's got a mesh, a silk mesh that is basically capturing the plankton as it's being towed through the water. And then that mesh is basically spun into a box. So there's like a stepping motor And so we actually can retrieve the location of where the samples were collected. It's a little bit coarse, so you know, you don't get tremendous spatial resolution, but you do get a lot of data. And the continuous plankton recorder, you know, when I was a young scientist just arriving at Cornell, it's like, why they had a meeting at Cornell of all places to discuss whether they should continue funding the continuous plankton recorder. And I was thinking at the time, oh, we have all of these great new technologies. We got video plankton recorders, we have acoustics, we can do all this great stuff. And what I would, and so it's like, why would we continue to do this? And I've completely changed my mind. You know, this is a technology from the 1930s, but because we have long time series that it's generated, it's incredibly valuable, maybe the most valuable oceanographic instrument that we use for biological oceanography in the regions where we have long time series from it. So now we can start to put together what was happening with the late stages, the stages that are in diapause for Calanus finmarchicus. And again, during that time period that we were interested in, we see this again, the drop in the NAO index with a time lag. We see the slope waters declining, and we see that Calanus finmarchicus abundance declines. And so this is confirmation of what we saw in 1998 on our cruise. We're seeing that in the continuous plankton recorder data. Oh, sorry. Let me go back if I can to say that. So in 1998, we saw this very low Calanus finmarchicus from the continuous plankton recorder, and that confirms what we saw in our cruise in 1998. So now we've now got this connection between the physical oceanography and the plankton, at least for the NAO. And then now we were interested in looking at what the impacts are on right whales. And the reason we selected right whales is because we know every single individual in that population. So it's an incredible species to conduct demographic studies on, because there's very few populations on the planet, whether you're on land or in the ocean, where you know all of the individuals in the population. So again, now we were going to ask this new question of how could these climate-associated changes in prey availability affect the recovery rate of the North Atlantic right whale? And I'm going to leave Aaron to talk mostly about that, but I'm going to mention here that the reason we were able to do this is because we have a long time series on right whales that goes back to the early 1980s. And this is the North Atlantic Right Whale Survey that's coordinated by the New England Aquarium, and the data archived by the North Atlantic Right Whale Consortium. So having these long-term data sets were incredibly important for enabling us to do the studies we were able to do. So now we're looking at the time series again. We can look at the years of interest. We can see that, you know, again, the drop in the NAO index, the cold water with a time lag in the deep basins, the drop in Calanus abundance, and look at what happens. Right whale calving rates drop precipitously in response to the drop in Calanus, which is their main source of nutrition, dropping to actually zero. And I came back from that cruise in 1998, went to an ocean sciences meeting, and I was supposed to give a talk on something entirely different. And I said, no, I'm just going to talk about what we saw on our cruise, because this is, and I'm going to make some predictions. And I had no data. All I had were pictures of the jars of our samples from those different years, showing the jars filled with Calanus, and in 1998, having just a few of them. And I said, I predict that we're going to see a big drop in right whales, that right whales are going to respond. So I said that in 1998, and this is 1999, and this is 2000. So that was kind of fun. But now, you know, that story hangs together for the late 1990s. But what happens when we start to look back to the 1980s? Well, you can see that this relationship with the NaO index and the slope water temperature still sort of hangs together. When the NaO is positive, these slope waters, tend to be warmer. And similarly, when we see the NaO index decline, we see a drop in the temperatures. But the relationship with Calanus and right whales drops off dramatically. Calanus is still influential in helping us understand why right whales are producing calves. But the whole story doesn't hang together the way it did. So that said to us, maybe that drop in the NaO index was only a small part of the story. And one of the things I want to also point out here is that it doesn't look like the Calanus right whale relationship hangs together that well, but that's because we actually plotted right whale calves here. And this population was increasing in abundance. So that's actually not a good measure. What you really want is a measure of the calves per female in the population. And we later created this right whale calving index that shows a much stronger relation with Calanus abundance. So what did we miss? There's, especially during this transition between the 1980s and the 1990s, there's something that is going on that's very different. And that is when we started looking up into the Arctic. And it's amazing to me now, looking back in it, that we were able to sort of develop the concept of this teleconnection of what was going on in the Arctic Ocean. So we're talking about looking, at the Arctic Ocean here and how it was driving marine ecosystems, all the way down here, in the Northwest, the full Northwest Atlantic, but all the way down to the Gulf of Maine. And as I said, that drop of the NaO index was important, but it was really an event. It wasn't something that had a long-term impact. What we subsequently found out is that there are decadal scale regimes in the Arctic Ocean. And I'm going to talk about this cyclonic regime, the AO positive. So normally you have in the atmosphere over the Arctic Ocean, it's a low pressure system. And during these cyclonic regimes, during positive Arctic oscillation, periods, though it's lower than normal. So that strengthens this counterclockwise or cyclonic circulation in the atmosphere. Whoops. Similarly, you have anticyclonic regimes where or Arctic oscillation negative phase, where the pressure is higher than usual. And so what happens then is you get a slowdown of this cyclonic circulation in the atmosphere. Now, it turns out that the Beaufort Gyre is incredibly important in the Arctic Ocean in terms of storing fresh water. So whether you have fresh water that's coming in, fresher water coming in from the Pacific through the Bering Strait, or you have fresh water coming in from runoff from the rivers in Siberia or for North America, that fresh water tends to accumulate in the Beaufort Gyre. And during negative Arctic oscillation conditions, you can see this cyclonic atmospheric circulation runs counter, right? The Beaufort Gyre goes clockwise. This atmospheric circulation is counterclockwise. So when we're in the negative NaO conditions, that allows the atmosphere slowing down, so it allows the Beaufort Gyre to spin up, okay? And when it spins up, it stores more fresh water in it. And we can actually measure the sea surface height associated with that fresh water. And that's what you're looking at over here is the gyre dynamic height. So that's actually a measure of how much the storage is going on in the Beaufort Gyre. And then when you go into the cyclonic regime, where now the winds pick up and you go into the strong cyclonic phase, it's going against the Beaufort Gyre. The Beaufort Gyre spins down, and that releases this fresh water, which then goes into the North Atlantic, part of it coming through the Canadian Arctic archipelago on the western side of Greenland, and part of it coming through Fram Strait on the eastern side of Greenland. And some of it comes down along this East Greenland current, joins up with the West Greenland current, and then that is what eventually feeds into the Labrador current system.
But it's not perfect.
Oh, no, there's water moving in different directions. So, and they're also, these create salinity anomalies, right? They're freshwater salinity anomalies coming out of the Arctic. And they're also going to come out of, they're not going to be aligned perfectly in time. They're going to be different time lags because it's a lot longer distance if you go around the east side of Greenland than if you come through the Canadian Arctic archipelago. And it turns out that most of the fresh water coming out of the Canadian Arctic archipelago is actually coming out as liquid water. And a lot of it that's coming out of Fram Strait is actually coming out as ice and then coming into the North Atlantic and melting. So there's some really cool stuff going on. And the only way we were able to sort of figure this out is that I started going to meetings of basically Arctic physical oceanographers, and they meet in different meetings, different workshops than the physical oceanographers that work in the North Atlantic. And I kept inviting them to come to our workshops to help us understand this, and they wouldn't come, so I had to go to theirs. But it helped me sort of put this picture together. So what we see in the time series now, there's this big change that occurred between the 1980s and the 1990s. And what happened is, we were in a period of negative AO conditions, so that the dynamic height, the fresh water was really stored to a great extent in the Beaufort Gyre. And then basically around 1990, there was a regime shift in the atmospheric circulation. We went into this positive AO phase, and then that led to a rapid decline in the dynamic height as that fresh water was being released. And then this is a measure, we call this the regional slope water salinity index, as opposed to the temperature index we use for the NAO. And we use this to characterize the salinity down in the Northwest Atlantic. And you can see, again, with a little bit of a time lag, you can see that this salinity dropped dramatically. And we were also, these are the same time series over here, but we're actually able to follow this freshwater salinity anomaly. It's called the Great Salinity Anomaly. We had those in the 1960s as well, but we had them in the 1990s. And we can see that it sort of first appeared in the Canadian Arctic archipelago in 1989, 90. And then, it was around 1991 where it reached Northeast Channel and started influencing the Gulf of Maine. And, now throwing even more time series at it, this period of time that we're looking at again, we're looking at the shift between 1980 and 1990 initially. This is what we looked at before, this change in the Arctic oscillation in the atmosphere, the drop in this measurement of the dynamic height is actually called the Arctic Ocean oscillation. So now this is the ocean, not the atmosphere. And you can see this is where the dynamic height of the Beaufort Gyre is declining. The salinities are going low down in the region we're interested in. And now we start to look at the time series of the biology. And what we saw is the continuous plankton recorder, they have what they call the phytoplankton color index, which is basically a measure of how much the net is discolored by the algae, the phytoplankton that basically accumulate on it. And what we saw, it wasn't something that happened throughout the whole year, but we saw particularly in the autumn that there was a big increase in this autumn phytoplankton color index. And what was happening is we were seeing much more production in the fall than usual. And the reason that was happening is that normally in the fall, in the Gulf of Maine and these other high latitude regions, the thermal stratification in the ecosystems break down. But now we had all this fresher water coming in, providing buoyancy, and that was keeping the water stratified so that the phytoplankton could continue to produce well, into the autumn and in one year, actually, right in through the winter. And again, we see the small copepods, like Andy was talking about, increasing dramatically in response to where they had been. We can see that the juvenile stages of Calanus also increased, like the small copepods. So, these are the early capepodite stages 1 through 4 of Calanus. So they're kind of doing what the small copepods are doing. And then the later stages, the ones that include the ones in diapause and the reproductive adults, they were doing the opposite. They dropped dramatically. And what we think might be the story here is that as these small copepods were becoming abundant, we also noticed that a lot of the planktivorous fish populations increase. So what we think is driving Calanus here, and this is really speculation, is that the planktivorous fish populations that increased in response to the lower trophic levels led to size selective predation on Calanus. So there is a combination of sort of bottom up processes going on in this ecosystem, as well as, at least for Calanus, top down processes. So that brings us to 2017 and what I call right whales in the wrong place at the wrong time. And Aaron's going to go into great depth about the details of this. But I just wanted to mention this here. It usually takes us a long time to realize that we're in a new ecosystem regime. That's why I kind of question Nick Record after watching 6 months. It's like, well, we usually have to see it. We have to be in a regime for a few years before you're in it. So it's almost like you can't really necessarily put the story together until the following decade. And so really this event in 2017 is what really triggered us to think, oh, what's going on in this decade? And unfortunately, it wasn't easy to piece it together because NOAA underwent budget cuts and they stopped counting the continuous plankton recorded samples from like 2009 onward. But the samples were still being collected and they were accumulating on the shelves in Plymouth, England at the Sir Alister Hardy Foundation. So I went to NSF. I said, give us some rapid response money so we can count those samples. And they said, oh no, we're not going to do that. I went to NOAA, give us some money. No. Finally, I went to the Lenfest Foundation, which is one of the Pew Charitable Trusts, and they gave us the money, and everybody was throwing up their hands trying to figure out what was going on. And, the Lenfest people gave us the money to count those samples, and that was what enabled us to put together the story. So this is the paper that Aaron and I were the lead authors on, basically figuring out what went on during the decade of 2010 to 2019. And, the paper was Ocean Regime Shift Driving the Collapse of the North Atlantic right whale population. We kind of had that hypothesis when this event happened in 2017, but we didn't have any data to test it with. But what it turns out, and this is really interesting. So those previous decades that we had studied were being driven by what was going on in the Arctic Ocean and these teleconnections, mediated by the Labrador Current and the Gulf Stream. What we're now seeing, and some of this is still a little bit speculative, but there's a lot of new studies coming out in the physical oceanography that sort of supports this. So, we have the meridional overturning circulation, the great conveyor belt in the ocean, and the Gulf Stream is the tail end of that. And what we saw is around 2010, we saw this tremendous warming going on in the Gulf of Maine. We saw the salinities increasing, and you might think, just based on your tuition, oh, well, the Gulf Stream must be intensifying. But that really wasn't what was happening. What was happening, so at the same time that your intuition would tell you that, the physical oceanographers were suggesting, well, actually, we think the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation is slowing down. So if it's slowing down and the Gulf Stream is the end of it, why would we expect that to happen? And so what it looks like, and the observational evidence is consistent with this, is as the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation is slowing down, the Gulf Stream is slowing down. And when the Gulf Stream was slowing down, just like a river, it starts meandering. And the meandering started shifting towards the shelf. And the meanders were also, of greater amplitude. So what we were seeing is Gulf Stream wasn't increasing in intensity, but its trajectory was changing. And those, that meandering was increasing the number of warm core rings that were being shed. It was also leading to the north wall of the Gulf Stream shifting up towards the Grand Banks, and influencing the amount of Labrador subarctic slope water making its way to the slope. So all of these things that we learned from that experience with the NAO kind of came back to help inform us as to what might be going on with this very different process. And then I'm not going to go into great detail here because Aaron will, but I'm just going to kind of characterize it with this time series. So we see this is the Gulf Stream index, and when it's positive, that means that the Gulf Stream is shifted to the north. So you can see, in the decade starting in 2000, just before 2010, the Gulf Stream started to shift north. And, we entered a regime through, 2010 to 2019, where the Gulf Stream was, significantly shifted to the north. We see that the slope water temperatures increased dramatically. Warm water is really not good for Calanus. So we see that Calanus abundance dropped, precipitously, right in line with the slope water temperatures. And we see that the calving rates dropped precipitously for right whales, just following the Calanus, as you would expect. All right, so I'm going to conclude this with this final slide. So, and this kind of goes back to the first slide that I showed you, that of Nick Record's discussion about a potential cold wave coming in. So what we're looking at, this is actually something that I pulled down from this website for the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. And what we're looking at is year on this axis, and we're looking at the different months of the year. And what you can see is that around 2010, things start to warm up, as you would expect. Now, these are sea surface temperatures. These aren't this isn't deeper in the water column, like where we would expect to see the slope water. But what you can see, we're using that heat wave detector that Alistair was talking about, and you can see heat waves. Here's here's that big one in 2012, right? And you can see that, there's very few significant marine heat waves prior to 2010. And then all of a sudden you start to see them much more active. And you can actually see, this is kind of cool because nobody's talked about this in the literature yet, but 2012 were the largest temperature anomalies observed in the Gulf of Maine. But look at 2021, 2022, and 2023. These are the next highest heat anomalies. So the Gulf of Maine has been really hot. It started getting hot in 2010, but it kept getting hot until 2023. And then Nick Records data is for 2024, so it's starting to get cold again. What that means on a multi-year decadal scale, we don't know yet. But what? Yeah. Oh, yeah, those are, let's see. So those are the warmest spring temperature anomalies. So they're the warmest ones seen. So you would probably go in here and pull out, the areas that are the reddest here.
From the 80s to the 2000s and 20s, it's the whole record, is the mean.
And it's a seasonal climatology. So the anomaly is based off of the seasonal climatology, as in the temperature.
Right.
At the end of decades for that Julian day or that 2-week period. Essentially it's been seasonally trended. Yes. But not interannual. Right.
So the last thing I want to leave you with, again, this is the figure coming from Nick Records' paper, and I want you to look at this time series. And what we can see is here's 2010 to 2023. So these are temperatures taken from a buoy at 250 meters. So we are looking at basically the slope waters that have come into the Gulf of Maine, warm and salty, right? And so what I want to sort of leave this group thinking about, I've been mostly talking about decadal scale regime shifts, which are very different from marine heat waves. But what seems to be going on here is this warm water that's come into the Gulf of Maine for the decade. This is a hypothesis. It's preconditioning the Gulf of Maine so that it becomes more susceptible to marine heat waves in the surface. Because in the wintertime, the water column becomes relatively well mixed. And so that heat preconditions things for the following summer when there's going to be a lot of heat flux through the surface. So I guess what we're seeing here is a combination of, what we're seeing if we're looking at the heat waves at the surface. It's a combination of the heat flux from the surface at that time, as well as the preconditioning heat that's come into the system for the decade. So this is I think, a really cool example. And this hasn't been analyzed yet in that way. But putting together a heat budget to figure out the contribution of, you know, this deep water input of heat and what's coming in through the surface would be a really cool analysis. So I'm gonna leave it there. Let's take a 10-minute break. I'm gonna stop recording.